Hi, Alex here at mixinglessons.com. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use a gate in your mixes. Gates can be really useful in mixing, and we use them to do a number of different things. One of the most common things that we do is we use them to reduce sound that we don't want, that we've captured as part of a recording. So let's take something like drums, for example. You may have a microphone on a snare drum, and you've captured the sound of the snare, but on that recording, you've also captured some bleed and some spill from the rest of the kit. What we can use a gate for is to ideally eliminate, but if not, at least reduce the sound of that spill to leave us with more of just the sound that we wanted to capture in the first place. You can do the same thing with something like a guitar amp. So a guitar amp might have some low-level hum or buzz or noise to it. And again, you can use a gate to try and reduce, but hopefully eliminate that noise. And the same can also be said for vocals. Maybe you've recorded vocals, but you've captured the sound of the fan from your laptop in the background, or a hum from an air conditioner, for example. Once again, we can use a gate to try and eliminate that noise that we don't want. And so an analogy that you can think of when it comes to gates is that the gate will open to let through the sound that we want, and then it will close to cut off the sound that we don't want. And in this video, we'll have a listen to some examples, and we'll look at what each of the different parameters on a gate does so that you know how to use one in your own mixes. And we'll also talk about a couple of the other ways that you might like to use gates as we go. So let's start off by having a listen. So we've got a snare drum track here. So you'll hear that on this track, we have the snare drum, which is what we wanted to capture, but we've also got some bleed from the rest of the kit. And so we'll start with the gate bypassed, and you'll be able to hear the snare drum, but also that bleed. And then I'll enable the gate, and you should hear that that bleed disappears and leaves us just with the sound of the snare drum. So as you can hear there, without the gate, we can hear the snare drum, but we can also hear some hi-hats and some kick drum. And then when we bring the gate in, it takes away that spill and it leaves us just with the snare drum, which is what we wanted to capture through that microphone. Now, why is it that we're able to do this with a gate? Well, the reason that we're able to do this, whether it be a drum recording like this or a vocal recording or a guitar recording, is that the sound that we don't want is at a lower level than the sound that we do want. And that brings us to the first parameter that we need to be aware of on a gate, and that's the threshold. So you can think of the threshold like this. Anything that gets louder than that point will make the gate open and allow the sound through. And anything lower than that point means that the gate will stay closed. Now, what's actually happening with the threshold is that anything which is below the threshold is actually being turned down even further by the gate. So it's already at a quieter level than the part of the signal that we want, but we're setting that threshold at a point where we say anything that's quieter than this, turn it down even further. And in some cases, we'll turn it down to the point where we can't hear it at all, or maybe we'll just turn it down a little bit, depending on what it is that we're looking to achieve by applying a gate to that signal. And so the threshold is saying anything which is quieter than this point, turn it down even further. Anything that's louder than this point, let it pass through unaltered. And that gives us the impression of the gate opening to let through the sound that we want and closing to the sound that we don't want. Now, where do you decide where to set the threshold? Well, if the gate is still letting through some of the sound that you don't want to hear, then you have the threshold set too low. And if the gate is cutting off some of the sound that you do want to hear, then you've got the threshold set too high. And so it's setting that point between the two where you're just letting the sound that you want go over the threshold and keeping the sound that you don't want beneath the threshold. Now, how do you control how much you're turning down the part of the signal that's below the threshold? Well, this somewhat depends on which plugin you're using, but generally you'll do this using either a range control or a ratio control or a combination of the two. Now, you'll notice here that this plugin says expander gate. Most gate plugins are actually a combination of an expander and a gate. Now, expanders and gates do two very similar things. They both turn down parts of the signal which are below the threshold. Traditionally, a gate would determine how much you turn down the level of the signal which is below the threshold using a range parameter, or it might sometimes be labeled as a depth parameter. And you would use that to set a decibel value on how much the signal should be turned down. Whereas with an expander, you would generally expect to use a ratio parameter to determine how much you're going to turn that signal down. And so rather than a decibel amount that you would turn the signal down by, you would turn it down by a ratio amount. So let's say you had a ratio of 3 to 1. For every 1 decibel, that the signal falls below the threshold, the gate will actually make the signal 3 decibels quieter than the threshold. So if something dropped 10 decibels below the threshold, it would actually come out of the gate 30 decibels quieter than the threshold. So it turns down those lower parts of the signal. Now, generally, when you hear people talking about either using a gate or using an expander, more often than not, when people refer to using a gate, they're referring to this process of turning the signal down to a point where it's inaudible on those parts that we don't want to hear. Whereas when people talk about using an expander, quite often they're talking about the process of just turning the signal down a bit, not necessarily turning it down to the point where it becomes inaudible. Now, having said all of that, those are not hard and fast rules. You will certainly find gates which use a ratio parameter and don't have a range parameter. And you may also hear people talk about applying a gate and they're just referring to turning the signal down a bit rather than turning it down a lot in the way that we would associate with a gate. So those are not hard and fast rules by any means, but most modern expander gate plugins are a combination of an expander and a gate, and you will quite often have both a range and a ratio parameter, and you use the two together. So let's have a look at how we would do that. So here I have this very much set up as a gate. We're using a ratio of 100 to 1, and we're applying a range of minus 80 decibels. So essentially anything that drops below that threshold is going to be pushed down to an inaudible level. But what would happen if we use this a little bit more like an expander? Let's say we apply a smaller ratio and a smaller range. In this instance, what would happen is the ratio is saying that anything that drops below the threshold is going to be turned down by a ratio of 3 to 1. And then the range is setting the maximum amount that the signal will be turned down by. So with these settings here, everything's going to be turned down by a ratio of 3 to 1, but nothing is going to be turned down more than 8.8 decibels. Now let's have a quick listen to a before and after of how that actually makes the gate or the expander work. We'll start with the plugin bypassed and then we'll bring it in. So what happens there is it brings the level of everything other than the snare down, but it doesn't take it down to the point where it's basically inaudible in the way that we would if we were trying to use this as a gate. Now, why might this approach be useful? Why might we want to turn part of the signal down part of the way, but maybe not all the way down to an inaudible level? Well, with something like drums, it might just make those drums sound a little bit more natural. In some genres of music, going with the more extreme approach of having things falling to silence in between each snare hit might be a little bit too much. It might be a little bit too noticeable. Whereas doing it this way might just let that snare drum pop out of the snare track a little bit more, but retains a slightly more natural feel to it. You may also think about something like vocals where you have the singer and they're performing their take, but in between lines you can hear them breathing in. You might not necessarily want to keep that at a particularly high level in the recording, but you also might not want to eliminate it entirely. It might retain a sort of natural edge if you leave that in. So you may just like to turn those breaths down rather than turning them down completely and removing them from the recording. And so there are just different approaches depending on what it is you're looking to achieve. So when I'm gating things like drums, or I'm trying to remove noise from a guitar amp, or background noise on a vocal recording, then I will generally want things to fall to an inaudible level. But if it was something like turning down the breaths on a vocal performance, or maybe in some genres of music where I wanted to retain a little bit more of a natural feel to those drums, then using this kind of approach might be a little bit more appropriate. It just depends what it is that you're trying to achieve by using this expander or gate. Now, the final 3 parameters that we need to know about are the attack, the hold, and the release parameters. Now, you can think of the attack parameter as how quickly or gradually the gate opens, and the release parameter as how quickly or gradually the gate closes. And then the hold parameter determines how long that gate will stay open before the release phase begins. And so it's very useful to use the hold and the release parameter in conjunction with one another so that you can retain the natural decay of different instruments. And having a hold parameter makes it a little bit easier to achieve better results rather than trying to do that with the release parameter alone. So generally with your attack parameter, if your attack is set too fast, you might get some distortion, you might get some audible clicks. On the other hand, if the attack is too slow, then you might lose the initial impact of drums, or you might lose the beginning of words because that gate isn't opening up quickly enough. So you've got to find that balance where the gate opens up in an appropriate way to let through the sound that you want. Now, the release parameter is controlling how quickly or gradually the gate closes, or essentially how quickly or gradually the gate goes back to a situation where anything that is below the threshold is being turned down to your desired amount, which you've set via the range or the ratio, or a combination of the two. Now, if the release is too fast, then you may cut off a note too early. So if you think of something like the decay on a drum, you may cut it off a little bit too early if that release is too fast. On the other hand, if it's too slow, you may let through some of the spill that you don't want. So again, you've got to find that balance. But on that point, because you can control how long something like a drum decays for using that release parameter, you can also use gating to make drums maybe a little bit more punchy in a mix by controlling the length of the note. And so that can be something else that you may find gates useful for during the process of mixing. And so all in all, gates can be very, very useful. Now, I don't gate drums all the time. Maybe 50% of the time I do, 50% of the time I don't. Sometimes it can sound really good. Sometimes it sounds better without gating the drums. Just depends what you're trying to achieve in various mixes. But knowing how to use a gate and having one on hand when you need one, whether it be to reshape drums and make them more punchy, or to clean up a noisy recording of a guitar amp, or a vocal, or reduce the spill on drums, or whatever it may be, knowing how to use this will almost certainly come in handy at some point in the course of your mixing. Now, we talked briefly there about making notes more punchy with a gate. You can do that with a gate, but you can also do that with a compressor. And if you haven't done already, I would encourage you to head over to mixinglessons.com/free-downloads and get your free compression cheat sheet, which will teach you how to achieve things like fatness and punch and level balance using a compressor when you mix. Now, we've been working here in Pro Tools, and this is the free version of Pro Tools, so you can download this DAW and start using this exact gate expander completely free if you want to, and I'll leave a video on screen which will show you how to import audio into a Pro Tools session to get you up and running so you can start experimenting with using this gate. Hope you found that helpful. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.